A tea seller said city customers loved anything that looked traditional, as long as it was clean and well arranged. A fabric seller laughed and said Tieu Lac's candy was so pretty it would sell itself if only she spoke loudly enough. That made everyone laugh. Tieu Lac smiled too, but her fingers tightened around the basket. When they finally arrived, she understood at once why everyone had been so excited. The traditional fair was much larger than anything she had imagined. Bright banners stretched over the entrance. Long rows of stalls stood beneath colorful awnings. Handmade signs swayed lightly in the breeze. The smell of roasted corn, tea, grilled cakes, sweet syrup, incense, herbs, and wood polish mixed in the air. Everywhere she looked, there were goods from different villages and towns: woven baskets, lacquer trays, embroidered cloth, clay toys, honey jars, herbal drinks, preserved fruit, rice wine, dried roots, old-style sweets, handmade fans, and things she could not even name. It was beautiful. It was overwhelming. For a moment, Tieu Lac just stood there with her basket in hand, taking it all in. Around her, people moved quickly with the confidence of those who knew what to do. She suddenly became aware of her plain clothes, her simple basket, her quietness. One of the older vendors from her group gave her a small push on the arm. "Don't freeze up now. Come on. Let's set up first. Be scared later." That made a few of the others laugh, and somehow the warmth of that laughter helped. Together they found their assigned area and began arranging their stalls. Someone helped Tieu Lac spread a clean cloth over the table. Someone else straightened her basket so the light would catch the candied fruit. An older woman leaned in, adjusted a few skewers, and said, "There, let them see the red shine first. Pretty things make people stop." Tieu Lac thanked them softly. When she finally stepped back and looked at her stall, it was still simple, but neat and inviting. The glossy candy shimmered under the morning light, and for the first time since arriving, she felt a small spark of confidence. Then the fair opened. Noise rushed in all at once. Families entered. Children pointed at colorful stalls. Young people wandered through in groups. Elderly couples stopped to admire handmade goods. Office workers on break slowed down to browse. Voices overlapped from every direction. Laughter rose and fell. Vendors began calling out with cheerful, practiced energy. "Come take a look. Traditional sweets here. Fresh village goods. Handmade, just made this morning." Tieu Lac stood behind her stall, both hands resting lightly on the table edge. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The sound around her felt too big, too full. Her voice, even in her own ears, seemed too small to survive in a place like this. A few people passed by her table without noticing. Others stopped at neighboring stalls where the sellers were lively and confident. Heat rose into her face. For a second she wanted to disappear. Then she thought of home, of the debts still waiting, of the people who had helped her come here. She took a breath and tried. Candied strawberries, handmade sweets. Her first call was barely louder than conversation. It vanished almost immediately into the noise of the fair. She swallowed and tried again. Candied strawberries, sweet fruit skewers. Please have a look. Still soft, still shy, but clearer. An older woman walking with a little boy turned her head slightly. The boy stared at the bright red candy and tugged her sleeve. That tiny reaction gave Tieu Lac just enough courage to keep going. She called again, and again. Each time her voice grew a little stronger. Not all at once, not suddenly, but little by little, like someone slowly finding solid ground under their feet. She began greeting customers more naturally. She answered questions. She smiled when children pointed at the candy. She suggested which skewers were sweeter, which had more fruit, which were best for sharing. And slowly people began to stop. A mother bought 3 skewers for her children. 2 students giggled, took pictures, then bought some for themselves. An elderly man said her sweets reminded him of the old village markets from his youth and bought several to bring home. Coins and notes began collecting in her small money pouch. With each sale, her shoulders relaxed a little more. The fair no longer felt like a giant wave ready to swallow her. She was still nervous, still careful, but now she had entered its rhythm. Her once whispered sales calls were now clear enough to draw attention. Her face, once lowered in embarrassment, lifted more often. There was still shyness in her, but now it moved alongside something warmer. Hope. Then, in the middle of handing a paper packet to a customer, she looked up and saw him. At first, it was only a glimpse. A familiar figure moving through the crowd. Tall, straight-backed, walking with the same calm, steady purpose she remembered. He was dressed more neatly than the day she saw him at the market. But something about the way he moved struck her instantly. It reached her before thought did. Her breath caught. For one suspended second, the sounds of the fair seemed to fall away. She saw only him. The young man she had been thinking of for days, the one who had stepped in when no one else would. The one she had never properly thanked, the one whose face had stayed in her mind even when she tried to focus on work. It was him. Her fingers froze around the paper packet. Her heart pounded so suddenly and so hard that she almost forgot where she was. She stared, afraid that if she blinked, the figure would vanish. Then instinct took over. She placed the packet down quickly and leaned forward, eyes fixed on him as he moved between the stools. She wanted to call out, wanted to step away from the table, wanted, at the very least, to move fast enough to make sure she had not imagined it. But just then, a customer stopped directly in front of her stall. "How much for these?" the woman asked, already pointing to the candy. Tieu Lac's whole body tensed. She looked past the woman's shoulder, trying to keep that familiar figure in sight between umbrellas, baskets, banners, and moving people. For one moment, she still saw him. Then the crowd shifted. Someone crossed in front of her line of sight. Another customer stepped closer. A child reached toward the table. A man carrying boxes passed between two stalls, and just like that, he was gone. "Miss?" the customer asked again. Tieu Lac forced herself back into the moment. She answered the price, wrapped the candy, accepted payment, thanked them politely. The moment the customer moved on, she lifted her head at once and searched the crowd. Nothing. No sign of him. Her heart sank with a disappointment so sharp it surprised her. For the next stretch of time, she continued selling, continued smiling, continued speaking to customers, but part of her mind was elsewhere. Every time she handed over a skewer, every time she thanked someone, every time she looked up, she was searching. Once she thought she saw his shoulder in the distance and nearly stepped out from behind the stall, only to realize it was someone else. Another time she spotted a familiar height and build, but when the man turned, it was not him. Each mistake left behind a small ache. By late afternoon, the fair began to thin. Families drifted away. Some stalls had already sold most of their goods. Vendors started counting earnings, stretching tired backs, folding cloths, repacking boxes. The bright noise of the day softened into the slower, heavier sound of people preparing to leave. Tieu Lac looked at her basket and felt two emotions at once. Relief because she had sold well, better than she had dared hope. And regret because the one person she wanted to see had disappeared again. As the light turned warmer and lower, she began packing up. She wrapped the remaining candy carefully, folded the cloth, gathered her paper, counted the money once, then tied the pouch shut. Her hands were busy, but her thoughts stayed restless. She had really seen him. She was almost sure of it. And still, just like before, she had lost him in the crowd. That quiet disappointment followed her as she bent to lift the basket, as she adjusted the tablecloth, as she reached for one last bundle near the corner of the stall. Then, while still half-turned, she looked up and froze. Standing directly in front of her, clear and unmistakable in the fading golden light, was the young man she had not been able to forget. This time he was not passing by, not disappearing into the crowd. He was standing there looking at her. And in that single stunned moment, before either of them spoke, Tieu Lac felt her heart race with one overwhelming thought. Fate had brought him back. Tieu Lac, a shy village girl, travels to the city fair for the first time, carrying her carefully made candied fruit and quiet determination. Surrounded by confident vendors and a lively crowd, she struggles at first to find her voice. But little by little, she gathers courage, calling out to customers, making small sales, and slowly finding her place in the rhythm of the market. Beneath her efforts, she carries a hidden hope, to see again the young man who once helped her during a difficult moment. In a fleeting instant, she spots him in the crowd, only to lose him again. As the day ends with both success and regret, fate intervenes once more, bringing him back, this time standing right before her.